Murdorf and the Mortal Flaw, Chapter 2, Harvest Celebration. Clang, clang, clang. The steel swords rang loud, echoing throughout the valley as the knights of the city of Seir trained on the mountain overlooking the city, a citadel hovering over a noble land. A cobblestone pavement jutting out from the adjoining building near the edge of the cliff was the instructor's ideal place for practice when weather permitted. Large columns surrounding a roof lined the arena, sheltering them from the searing sun and the rain that blew in from time to time. The towering trees were taking on the iridescent array of fall colors. Below in the valley, the citizens of Seir were gleefully preparing for the festivals of the week, the celebration of their yearly harvest, a 5-day festival. This was a big event, drawing many of the diverse citizens from across the land of Shalahem to join in the fun. Atop the mountain, Nimri's sword swung low towards Cosby's knees. Cosby swung hard and fast, blocking the blow with his own sword and parrying it towards Nimri's left side. Cosby then came in with a straight jab, thrusting towards Nimri's neck. Nimri stepped back, his footwork unconsciously precise, and blocked the attack with the sword. Nimri then attempted to step behind Cosby and make a killer attack, but Cosby was far too skilled, as he parried his sword, blocking it. "You're going to have to do better than that, mate," Cosby said, showing his arrogance. "I'm just giving you ample opportunity for practice," Nimri retorted as he brandished his weapon for another go. "I wouldn't be so self-assured if I were you," said Cosby. Back and forth they continued, skillfully sparring without missing a beat. Beneath their mail, their tired bodies were bathed in sweat. The noise of their swords were merely another clang among the many swords and shields reverberating across the mountain range, like a melody that sang of national pride and security to its citizens below. The bell rang loud, and Gilmanza, the chief instructor of the school, held up his right hand. A scar marring his arm and hand gave weighty testimony of a man with many wars. "Attention! Bond your swords," said Gilmanza. In haste, the student body of knights lined up shoulder to shoulder and in rows at Gilmanza's command. In one synchronized motion, they placed their steel swords in their sheaths, marched their feet on the ground, and placed their arms to their sides. A gentle wind blew Gilmanza's gray hair as he stood in front of his students. The sun shone on his back, casting a shadow across his face, camouflaging his wrinkles. He was a man of many life experiences, and he had led Shalahem into more than a few successful battles. Although a veteran of many wars, he was a gentle man, time having softened the once rough edges. With every stroke a cut above the rest, he had been fortunate enough to escape death. Despite his age, he was as nimble as the young lads he trained. Novatian, an accomplished knight and assistant to Gilmanza, stood at Gilmanza's right. For a moment, all that could be heard was the heavy breathing of the knights as they sucked in air. "At ease, noble knights," Gilmanza said, scratching his face beneath his gray beard. Straightway the knights pulled off their helmets and held them beneath their left arms. Pools of sweat rolled from their heads and down their faces, dripping onto the stone pavement. "Your expertise is made evident in your skill. Even so, the skill of the knight is not all there is to knighthood. Remember, a sword is no more powerful than the one who swings it. It is no more a weapon of defense than the man who bears it, and it has no more heart than the one who possesses it. It has no more nobility than the man who uses it for noble purposes. Knighthood is also about character and honor," said Gilmanza. "Always remember," he concluded, "it is the character of the knight that gives honor to the sword. So bear it with humility. Aggression does not befit a knight. so walk in peace. And fear does not befit a knight, so remain steadfast and courageous. Now, go in peace." After they had bowed towards Gamanza, the class of swordmasters was dismissed. "What say ye we meet up at sunset for the celebration tonight?" Cosby suggested to Novatian and Nimri as he ran a towel over his wet, dark blonde hair. "That sounds good to me," answered Novatian, reaching for a towel. "How about an hour before sunset and we'll play Triple B," suggested Nimri. "You're on," answered Cosby. Novatian agreed, grinning at his friends as he ran his hands through his long hair. "Be sure to bring your sister," Nimri yelled to Novatian. "Oh, she's out of your league," Novatian said, teasing him. The sun shone down on Novatian's sweaty olive skin, casting sheen on his muscular frame as he strolled across the stone pavement towards his horse. He seemed to be a man who had it all: personality, looks, skill, and strength. His sable brown eyes decorated his dark eyebrows were like the decorating work of an embroiderer, crafted with the most skilled of hands. His rugged appearance did him no harm either. In fact, he wore the look all too well. Even so, he did not have a girlfriend. He was far more interested in the duty of his country. But women were still high on his list. He had yet to find the gal of his dreams. Although the three had been best friends since childhood, Novatian was more mature. Because he had been eager to learn from his superiors, he sat among the elite councilmen of the king. Cosby was an earth dweller, a community of people whose homes are beneath the earth. He had long since left the community and bought a house beside his friend Nimri. Cosby was well disciplined in his training, but he tended to be a little overconfident. If he could wear accolades, he would. The setting sun cast a beautiful array of orange hues across the sky. Dressed in celebration clothing, people had begun to gather on the hillside with their musical instruments. As the sun slowly vanished and the hillside populated with people, the comfortable night air became fragrant with the aroma of apple pies, grilled meats, and baked delicacies. Pumpkins, melons, and various kinds of squash adorned the hillside on lurries as a witness to their abundant crops. Dried gourds painted fantastic colors by children were streamed at various places along the hillside. Strategically placed torches lit up the space, casting eerie shadows along the outskirts of the forest, giving form to the darkness. Shadows danced along the celebration as though telling a story of a time when darkness first collided with light. "Yes, 5," said Novatian. Novatian, Nimri, and Cosby were high with emotions in their game of Triple B, booing and jeering. Triple B stood for betrayal, betrothal, and bloodshed. The game was played with a single die and a drawn-out board resembling an ancient and complicated map. The winner was the one who successfully reached the castle with the rescued girl. Novatian's time to roll came again, and he rolled a 6, just what was needed to gain the betrothal. "Yes!" he cried in triumph. "Yes, but the quest is dependent upon you keeping her and making it to the castle," Nimri reminded him. "You start well, but a man should reserve all such boasting for when he takes off his armor." Nimri flipped his dark hair away from his face as he picked up the die. Nimri and Cosby were now tied. Nimri rolled a 5. "At last! I got the sword. My sword may take your fair lady away, mate," Nimri said to Novatian. Cosby rolled. "Cosby, you're the betrayer," the other two mocked. "You laugh now, but you won't be laughing when I betray you." They continued rolling the die and moving their game pieces along the game board, trying to win the fair lady and make it to the castle. The most enjoyable experience about playing Triple B was that each time it told a different story of betrayal, betrothal, and bloodshed. Music and dancing, eating and laughing had broken out on the hillside as the grand festivals escalated. The sound of music filled the air, and the scent of delicacies drifted for miles, teasing the nostrils as far as the wind carried the pleasant aroma. Citizens had come from across the land, the earth dwellers who live southwest in the hills of the Shavi, and a few wadis from the south came too. Some Gamets who live in the rural southland came, their flexible ears folded over like earmuffs on the sides of their heads. But it is their large floppy cheeks that stood out as most unusual, were large enough to store cantaloupe in each thigh. From the southeast region came a handful of country folks, known as hemps. Hemps sort of resembled a colossal of a goat and a human, with their goatish teeth, beady eyes, floppy ears, and wiry hair. The rest of their bodies were humanoid. Wearing overalls and simple clothing, they are known as generally hard workers, plowing and planting, watering and weeding. A tall and lanky old man, donning a pointed, stable-colored hat, moved through the crowd, his sights upon the three men playing their game. "Ah, I'll take your fair lady, mate," Nimri said to Novatian. "Well, that fair lady is not as fair as the one I see coming through the gateway," said the old man with long silver hair and elegated gray beard standing behind them. "Windsor!" they shouted. Taking in Windsor's reference of a fair lady, Nimri gazed over Windsor's shoulder, immediately spotting Novatian's sister through the crowd. "Speaking of fair ladies," Novatian reminded them, laying out the redemption money to buy back the fair lady in their competitive board game. "Oh, man, that's not fair," said Cosby. Rolling the die, he landed a 6. Moving him and his fair lady 6 spaces, Novatian landed his game piece on the castle. Leaning back in a relaxed position, he said, "What says you to that, mate?" "Well, you can take your wooden fair lady," Nimri said, dropping the die. "I'm going for the real deal." "Well, cronies, looks like he rolled the 6, which gives him enough points to kill you with his sword, you betrayer," Novatian said to Cosby. "And I know you don't have enough money to buy yourself life," he added. Cosby stuck out his bottom lip in a playful manner. They laughed and made room for Windsor. Suddenly the voice of a woman calling out for Novatian resounded through the crowd. It was a young woman with a crush on him, a crush that was not reciprocated. Snickering, Cosby shuffled out of the woman's way, giving her a bird's-eye view of Novatian's surprised face. Hearing his name above the noise of the crowd, Novatian spotted the pesky woman. "Oh, I think it's time for me to turn in, mates," he muttered. Aware of the young woman's infatuation of the man, his friends laughed heartily. Pushing and shoving her way across the populated hillside, she yelled his name over and over. But Novatian slipped through the crowd, ducking as he ran, until finally he reached the edge of the masses where the dark street to home lay before him. Novatian turned the corner at the Knight's Armory and Dragon Range store at a near run. As he accelerated around the corner, he ran smack into someone, knocking the individual to the ground. "Oh!" yelped a woman. "Brute beast," she uttered beneath her breath. "Oh, excuse me, let me help you up." Through the shimmering of the moonlight, Novatian caught a glimpse of the delicate face of the individual he had knocked down, instantly losing all words. Her long, dark brown hair with auburn highlights, dark olive complexion, and vibrant green eyes made him weak in the knees. He was utterly embarrassed that he had just plowed over the most beautiful of all women in the kingdom, the princess. "Please accept my apologies, Princess," Novatian said, helping her up. As she got steady on her feet, she got a better look at her brute beast and quickly realized that he was no beast at all, but a rather handsome man, a man she recognized. Awestruck by her beauty, Novatian struggled to get out the right words. Please do accept my apologies, Princess Nadora. I was in a hurry." "Obviously," she said, brushing off her black jacket with jade trim. The tailored jacket accentuated her petite and shapely form and black riding pants drew attention to her shapely legs and firm bottom. She pulled off her riding coat to brush off the lingering dirt, revealing her conditioned arms. The silver studs around her collar and the studded leather belt around her waist gave her a fashionable touch of royal toughness. While many women were stuck in the traditions of long dresses, this princess refused to be molded by the ancient practices, paving her own way towards her identity as a woman and warrior. Even as she was dusting off her jacket and railing at him, Novatian couldn't help but notice the particles of dirt on her well-rounded bottom. "You have—" he began, unable to get a word in edgewise. "What were you thinking?" asked the princess. "I do apologize, princess." "Very well, then. Apology accepted." "You have—" Novatian tried again to point out her soiled yet delectable posterior. "Next time, watch where you're going," the princess concluded, putting her well-dusted jacket over her shoulders. "Yes, my lady." He reached down and picked up a black and silver brooch that had fallen from the princess's royal raiment. It depicted chivalry in the finest of art. "I believe this is yours," Novatian said, looking into her vibrant eyes. "Yes," she replied, her tone now softened. "Thank you." Disrupting the conversation was the pesky sound of a woman's voice in the near distance. "Novatian! Novatian!" He took advantage of the distraction. "Now, if you will excuse me, and please don't mention that you saw me." Novatian bowed politely. He sauntered down the road and then stepped behind a building to hide from his determined pursuer. The princess sashayed off, unaware that her bottom was still covered in dirt. She looked back at Novatian and then smiled as the woman approached her. "Have you seen a man coming this way?" inquired the woman. "Well, I have seen several men come this way. I doubt if I would know what sort of man you speak of." She giggled as she walked off, looking over her shoulder at Novatian, hiding in the shadows. Taking one last look back at the princess, Novatian admired her backside as she disappeared into the darkness. "Of all people to run over, why did I run over the princess? The princess!" he muttered. The night's festivities eventually died down and the lights went out all over the city of Seir. The city was now still and quiet. All the while Elk was in his home entertaining himself with the intriguing power of his new sword. With both hands wrapped around the sword, he practiced against an imaginary opponent, daydreaming of becoming venerated as an accomplished swordsman. He fantasized of becoming powerful, respected, and esteemed among the heroes of the world. Thoroughly obsessed with his dazzling new toy, he had completely forgotten about the festivities. The sword made him feel strong and confident, yet also vengeful, superior, and powerfully charged with authority, something he had never felt in his life. The night air was crisp as the second night of festivities was under way. The sound of folk music mingled with the boisterous laughter as people danced to the music. Novatian, Cosby, Nimri, and Windsor sat atop a stone wall, watching the dancing and conversing among themselves. Suddenly, an array of luminous blue lights sprang from the edge of the forest, gathered around the circle of children, and spiraled up from the ground, rotating like a tornado decorated with lights. Then, a group of red, yellow, and green lights did the same, creating a resplendent, iridescent work of art in the night sky. Synchronized to the music, the clusters of lights created images of a dog, a flower, a whale, and lastly a dragon. All eyes looked up, especially the wide eyes of the children, who were in awe of the fantastic pictures in the sky. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the lights scattered in every direction, some falling to the ground. A burst of orange-yellow fire shot up into the sky as another small flame began to fall towards the crowd. "Uh-oh," whispered the culprit. With wide eyes, everyone began to run. The fire fell to the ground, and to the good fortune of the instigator, the flame landed in the fire pit where some men had been trying to ignite the fire to roast a pig. Much obliged. The men nodded their heads with approval and then laughed, pleased that they now had fire. Out of the darkness emerged a rather odd-looking fellow wearing a purple hat. 2 colored braids hung down the left side of his head, one green, the other purple. Braids and beads also hung randomly throughout his hair. His brown staff, riding boots, and riding pants added a touch of earthy tone, neutralizing his love for purple. It was Navi the prophet. A rather quirky character, some might call him hip, a prophet for a new generation. His short, stubby brown beard gave him a rugged look, belying his youth. And to his offbeat character he walked with a bounce to his step as though he had springs in his shoes. However strange some might perceive him, he was a man of integrity, respected as one who had been a prophetic voice in the land. Many young ladies found him a rather handsome man. Even so, he was a confirmed bachelor, ever on the prowl for a good woman. "Good to see you, mate," Novatian addressed him. "You too, crony," replied Navi. Windsor broke into their pleasantries with a growl. "How many times do I have to tell you not to use your powers for entertainment?" He tapped his crooked staff on the ground. "Until your last breath," Navi answered lightheartedly. "Well, apparently so. Do you really think it is appropriate to use the lightning bugs for entertainment? You change their color just for pleasure. Not to mention, you make them sickly dizzy from spinning them like that." Just as Windsor said this, a green firebug fell where they sat, flapping around in a drunken stupor. "Don't be such a rigger. Even God delights in the joy on children's faces," said Navi. "Yes, well, your little flash of fire could have injured someone," Windsor argued. "I had everything under control," Navi said, pointing to the fire pit. "They couldn't light the fire, so I helped them." He laughed as he twitched his upper lip, an idiosyncrasy he had when he was not telling the truth in its entirety. "I call it luck," Windsor said. Navi turned his attention to the children, still laughing with the excitement of the firebugs. Windsor crossed his eyes with candid irritation and then sighed, showing his aggravation. "Remember when you tried to help me catch Mr. Vern's cat and you accidentally scorched his tail?" asked Nimri, laughing. Cosby and Novatian, recalling the event, snickered too. Nimri began imitating the cat's terrorized facial expression, provoking even more laughter. Navi jerked his head to the side, desperately gesturing to Nimri to be quiet, but the young knight continued to rattle on about the disastrous cat story. Windsor set his piercing eyes upon Nimri and grunted in disapproval. Navi looked away, pretending not to see the mentor's chastening eyes. Ignoring Navi, Nimri rattled on between the chortles. When it finally ran off, its tail was singed clean. Now every time it sees Navi, it runs away as fast as it can. Nimri concluded, his belly aching with laughter. Windsor had listened to the tale with growing agitation. "You must not abuse the call and gifts you have been given. They should be treated with respect," said Windsor. "You know experientially the sacredness of the call." Nimri now offered candid laughter as an option. Meanwhile, Novatian and Cosby were attempting to curb their own laughter, but the more they tried, the harder it was to keep a lid on it. Ignoring Windsor, Cosby chimed in, exposing another of Navi's pranks. "Remember the time you were trying to impress that girl? You were on top of the wall practicing your sword forms with an imaginary opponent, and you—" Cosby told the story through broken speech and bursts of snorting laughter. Navi was again trying to silence him without using physical restraints. "You grabbed your staff and shot out a burst of power that knocked you off the wall. When you finally sat up, your hat was crushed and you were covered in mud. You failed to impress the girl. She was laughing as hard as I was." The entire group was in stitches again, except for Windsor, who grimaced through his stony and wrinkled face. Navi found no comedy in Cosby's version of humor. "I was not trying to impress her," Navi protested. "You're laughing and almost broke my neck in an honest session of practice." Enjoying the belly-aching laughter at Navi's expense, Novatian picked up the round, telling more stories of Navi's humiliating moments. The night air, thick with the aromas of seared meat and fresh-baked bread, awakened Elk's senses, reminding him of the celebration. He had been toying for hours with his new sword. The smell of food called to him, so he tucked his sword into its sheath and buried it beneath the riding coat. With his hand on the hilt of his blade, he entered the festivities. Trying to stay inconspicuous, he skulked around the edges, but his efforts failed him. "Hey, there's Elk," said one of his pals. "Come over here and eat with us," said another. Reluctantly, Elk accepted the offer and gathered with his friends. He fumbled with his sword, repeatedly fondling it, unable to keep his hands away. He grinned with excitement over the surging strength he felt with each touch, unable to control his enthusiasm. His friends found him distracted, not acting like his normal self. After scarfing down his food, he rose and then shuffled through the crowd, making his way out of the celebration. He strolled past the wall that Windsor and the others were perched upon. He then made his way down a dark street, his right hand petting the sword strapped to his side. As he rounded a corner, two men were leaning against a wall. They had a reputation for causing trouble, and if all their deeds were known, they would be hung from the gallows. Elk was not ignorant of some of their misdeeds. In fact, he had stumbled upon them in the very act of beating a man and robbing him of his very earned money. The two men had threatened to kill Elk if it was told of their damnable sin. As Elk's shadowy figure became clear to the two men, they immediately began to scoff at him. "Looky there, it's the weakling who couldn't make it as a real knight," mocked one of the men, laughing. "Oh, look, Randolph, he's even carrying a sword," the other sneered. "You want us to show you how to use that?" The man pulled his sword from its sheath and placed the tip of the blade at Elk's throat, reminding him of his obligation to remain silent. "I think we should just go ahead and end him. Then we won't have to worry about him babbling his mouth." As they slung insults and threatened him with death, varied agitation began to arise within Elk, an agitation he thought he had overcome. Getting in Elk's face, the man shoved him and waved his big sword. As Elk stroked the sword at his right side, agitation turned to fierce anger, and he gained confidence as well as a lust for revenge. An unfamiliar fire coiled inside. Without thinking, Elk pulled his sword from its sheath and let the rage consume him. "Oh, look! Waterboy has pulled his sword," mocked one of the men. "You might as well put that back where you got it, boy," jeered the other, waving his sword in Elk's face. "You might hurt yourself with it," his sword poking at Elk's belly. In a flash of rage, Elk swung his blade, crossing it with the troublemaker's sword. Now the two began a duel. Elk quickly gained the upper hand, and knocking the bully's blade from his hand, disarming the man. Without thinking, Elk swung his sword across the man's abdomen, spilling his guts into the street. As the man fell in his own blood, his eyes gaped with disbelief. Stunned, the other man frantically drew his sword. Elk was as surprised as he was, and felt near faint from the sight of blood. He shuddered, but only for a moment. As he clutched the sword, the dizziness was replaced with confidence. "Day after day I have listened to you threaten me," Elk said evenly, turning to face the man. "Well, no more. What do you have to say now? Now that a sword is placed at your throat like you have done to me?" Elk was yelling now, poking the tip of the Sword of Darvan against the man's chest. Flickering shadows divulged a look of fear in the face of the hardened criminal. The man's hand trembled as he stared into the angry eyes of a madman. I was only playing. Come on, let's call a truce. His words quivered nearly as much as his body. We can be friends, and I'll never tell anyone. I'll even help you get rid of his body. Not convinced of quick compliance, the man extended his sword. Don't try to pacify me, Pete. I'm no fool. Elk raised his sword. You deserve death and hell. It was then that Pete noticed the rubies on the handle of the sword. He felt an energy around the spear of the sword. The Sword of Darvan, he whispered as he stared into the contorted face of rage. But it can't be. Suddenly, Elk thrust the sword through the man's body. It wasn't bad the second time. Pulling his sword from the man's abdomen, Elk stared upon the dying man in disbelief of what he had done. Hearing voices in the distance, Elk hurried down the dark street. A scream testified that the dying man was discovered. A young woman ran to the outskirts of the festival shouting for help. Windsor, Novatian, Navi, Cosby, Nimri, and Gamonza were leaning against the wall in earshot of the woman's outcry. A crowd began to gather around the bodies. Windsor, Gamonza, and Navi rushed ahead of them and pressed their way through to the infamous dying man. As blood pooled out of the man's mouth, he muttered the fatal words, "The Sword of Darvan." The words shook inside Windsor's soul. The naming of the sword conjured up the secret Windsor had held for ages, a secret that ran deep with shame and remorse. His experiences with that sword had caused him pain and had plagued him with guilt from his first encounter to his last. It was a mark of reproach upon his integrity and a constant reminder of his mortality. He only hoped it would not expose his shameful past and bring to light his deep and dark secret. "The Sword of Darvan," repeated Windsor, looking up at Gamonza. "Are you sure?" asked Windsor, seeking clarity. "Sword of Darvan," he whispered again. "Who?" asked Gamonza. "Who has the sword?" With a gurgling noise, the man's body fell limp. Windsor and his companions pushed their way out of the crowd that had gathered around the bodies and walked over to the edge of the wall where they had been watching the splendor of the kingdom at peace, each now knowing that their peaceful kingdom was about to be shaken. "It has begun," said Windsor, a quickening of his spirit confirming what he knew to be true. No one else heard what he said as he was dying except us. "We tell the king and no one else," warned Windsor. Gamonza warned, "If news of this spreads, some, eager for power, will seek it out. There will be utter chaos." "Well, I have heard many legends of the Sword of Power," whispered Cosby. "Legends? Well, they are far more than legends," said Windsor, placing his hand on the orb of his staff and leaning forward attentively. Visible tension rose among the many wrinkles that mapped his forehead. Concern surged in his eyes. This wasn't his first encounter with this sword. He was familiar with it and its destructive ways more than he wanted to admit. He knew its past. He knew its future. He was familiar with the prophecies, some of which he knew through personal ecstatic experiences, and some he wished he could forget. With a look of dread on his stony face, Windsor muttered, "The Sword of Darvan. So we will meet again. Come, let's go tell the king." Meanwhile, Elk had inconspicuously snuck out of the crowd and skulked to the edge of the woods. Hiding behind a cluster of fig trees, he stared in disbelief at the sword. Seeking to justify his actions and relieve his guilty conscience, he conversed with himself, noting the many transgressions as proof the men deserved what they got. Beneath the shimmering of the soft moonbeams, captivated by the seducing power of the sword, Elk held the sword close to his chest and stroked it as he wondered about the atrocious tales associated with the Sword of Power.